Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are logging in from. Welcome to the first in a series of webinars we are hosting this year on integrated energy planning. My name is Jem Porcaro. I am a senior advisor at Sustainable Energy for All, where I focus on energy planning and policy, the energy and health nexus, among other energy issues. And I'm really delighted to be your moderator for today's discussion. Now, this webinar series is really all about showcasing best practices and important areas within the field of integrated energy planning. Here at SE for All, we believe integrated energy planning is an indispensable kind of first step towards achieving universal energy access. When done right, planning can provide policymakers, industry, donors, DFIs, a very useful roadmap for scaling up access, along with really valuable insights into the optimal mix of solutions for achieving an energy access target, along with their associated costs. Now, today's webinar is going to focus on an often overlooked and underinvested aspect of energy planning, which is understanding demand. The fact is, in the world of energy access planning, there has long been an imbalance in the amount, the quality, and the emphasis, frankly, given to demand side data as compared to supply. And this means that energy planners often rely on overly simplistic assumptions about energy demand, which in turn makes it very difficult to right-size infrastructure and to find really truly appropriate and cost-effective solutions. So in order to supply energy, whether it be kind of electricity or clean cooking solutions in an economically sustainable manner, kind of at the community level, integrated energy planning must better reflect the needs, the constraints, and ultimately the differences between underserved communities. And to do that, we need better data. And obviously, this is not something that just SE for All believes. It's actually what the sector is increasingly calling for. In fact, last summer, SE for All hosted a workshop with more than kind of 30 data and planning experts, many of whom I'm sure are on this call, around this issue of demand. Or I should say, demand was really kind of one of the top issues that came out of this workshop in terms of what practitioners and planners wanted to see further progress on. And so it was with that in mind that we decided to start our webinar series this year, focusing on this issue of demand and how to better reflect it in energy access planning. But instead of rehashing the problem, we wanted to use today's discussion to highlight where some progress and innovation is actually taking place. And to do this, we've actually invited a few leading data and planning experts to talk about how they're making use of, in particular, satellite imagery, machine learning, and other kind of data analytics to better understand energy demand and how that data is then being used to improve planning. Now, demand is, of course, is a multifaceted issue. So for the purposes of today's discussion, we've decided to focus on three aspects of demand that are particularly important to planning. The first is, better predictions of electricity consumption, what people consume in the way of electricity and energy. The second is measuring consumer affordability. And the third is understanding kind of the agricultural and energy nexus, which is a topic that is of particular interest to the off-grid sector and mini-grid developers, um, along with others. So those are the three kind of facets of energy demand that we're going to explore in this webinar today. Of course, there are others, but for the sake of time and focusing on some of the more important issues, we wanted to focus on these. Today's webinar is going to be structured kind of in a few parts. After my kind of opening remarks, we will hear from experts and speakers who will talk to each of these issues and say a little bit about work they are doing to advance data in these three buckets, these three aspects of demand, and hopefully also talk about how the data that they are generating is being used to improve energy access planning. At the end of the webinar, the last 30 minutes or so, we're going to have a bit of a moderated discussion. I will kind of take the privilege of probably taking the first 15 minutes to ask some questions and kind of have hopefully a lively and dynamic discussion with our guests, and then turn it over to questions from the audience. So we should, in total, this should be run about an hour and a half. I really encourage you to stay with us throughout the webinar, as I think the last half an hour, 30, 40 minutes is really going to be interesting as we kind of have more of an exchange with our speakers. Now, in terms of housekeeping, we definitely encourage you all to take advantage of the chat function to ask any questions that you might have of our speakers. We are making note of these, and we will try to get through as many of them as possible, again, towards the end of the webinar. Also just encourage you to use the chat function to have conversations kind of on the side. In our experience, that often leads to some really lively discussions. So feel free to have kind of sidebar chats or conversations along the way. This webinar is, of course, being recorded. The presentation in the deck we will try to make that available to everyone after the webinar. That and a kind of a recording will be posted on SE4All's website in the coming days. So I do encourage you all to check www.se4all.org for a recording of this webinar along with the slides. So I think that's probably enough housekeeping. Let me see if I've forgotten anything else. No, I think that's it. Let me quickly introduce our four speakers today, starting with Simone Fobi, who is a fifth-year mechanical engineering PhD student in the Sustainable Energy Lab at Columbia University. She is part of a multi-university collaboration called eGuide, where she develops techniques to understand and predict electricity demand for yet-to-be connected households. She's going to be teamed up with Tobias Engelmeyer, who is the founder and managing director of TFE Energy, a Berlin-based data and analytics firm that is known for its use of, AI-powered tools that utilize satellite imagery and energy modeling to identify off-grid villages and assess their suitability for off-grid electrification. So Simone and Tobias will be kind of teaming up, as you saw in the earlier slide, to talk about this issue of predicting electricity demand. Following Simone and Tobias, we'll hear from Madeline Gleave, who's the chief data scientist at Nithio. Nithio is an energy finance platform that provides analytics and financial solutions to businesses, capital providers, governments, and other kind of stakeholders in the distributed energy sector in Africa. And Madeline leads Nithio's data team in utilizing, again, machine learning to better understand, among other things, consumer risk across Africa. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Karen Brines, who is the Director of Partnerships at Atlas AI, which is a California-based data and software firm that uses remote sensing to estimate kind of the socioeconomic activity in low and middle income countries, and is really particularly known for its work on agricultural value chains. So Karen will kind of round out the discussion by talking about, again, kind of agricultural productivity and the data behind it and how that data could be used for energy access planning purposes. So I want to welcome all of our speakers. Thank you for joining us. I think this is a fantastic lineup. I'm going to now invite Simon and Tobias to kick us off and spend the next probably 15 minutes talking about their work to forecast electricity consumption demand in off-grid communities. So Simon, I think you're going to probably start and then hand it over to Tobias. Your slides should be up now, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jem. Good morning or good evening, everyone. I'm Simone Phoebe, and I'm a PhD candidate in mechanical engineering at Columbia University. My supervisor is Vijay Modi, who has made a lot of developments in this field also. So today I will be jointly presenting with Tobias on behalf of eGuide, and I'll be talking about our electricity consumption prediction service and how village data analytics has leveraged that service to make village level plans for electrification. So next slide, please. eGuide, like Jem mentioned, is a multi-institute initiative, and we focus on developing and deploying custom data analytics tools for the energy and electricity sector in developing economies. Our team consists of researchers from Columbia University, University of UMass Amherst, RIT, CMU, Colorado School of Mines, and we're funded by Rockefeller Foundation. Specifically today, I'll be talking about eGuide's electricity prediction service that combines historic consumption data from utilities and uses that in addition to other data sources like satellite imagery to predict levels of consumption for individual buildings. Specifically, we take in satellite images and we pass it through our custom CNN models and output the probability that a building would be a high or low user of electricity upon electrification. So this service is really forward-looking. We can make predictions, or we infer predictions for multiple buildings as shown below, where blue buildings are low consuming buildings and red buildings are predicted as high consuming buildings. Next slide, please. Having inferred those predictions for, in the case of Kenya, close to 12 million structures, here I present an aggregated version that anyone can really interact with on our API. So areas that are blue are places that have a lot of low consuming structures, whereas areas that are red are places that have a lot of high consuming structures. So with this data available currently for Kenya, we're hoping to extend it to other countries. So have predictions available for Uganda, for Rwanda in the next coming months. We also want to move beyond the residential sector into more small and medium-sized enterprises. Like I mentioned before, the good thing is the service is open and free to anyone. So you can request an API key at using info@eguide.io. I'll be passing over to Tobias, who will now talk about how they leverage outputs from our service to make village level decisions on electrification.
We can hear you, Tobias.
Right, good. Okay, thank you. If you could go to the next slide, please. Great. Thank you, Simone, for this first part of our story. So I think we were one of the first users of the eGuide dataset, and what we did is we integrated it into our larger village data analytics planning tool that allows people to assess energy demand and the viability of sites at the level of entire villages. Village data analytics, what you see there on the right-hand side is the user interface of village data analytics for an assessment we have just done in Ethiopia. To give you an idea, what we do is we use our own algorithms to identify villages, and then we extract village level information such as settlement structures, grid access. We've developed our own grid light algorithm that understands if a place is likely electrified or not. Then we look at energy resource, road infrastructure, different other things, including agriculture. And then if you go to the next slide, please. Now you see one back. Thank you. Now you see the user interface, that's the village level view, where we then use our algorithms to predict energy demand and investment viability at the level of villages. This can be done at scale for countries, for continents if needs be, and it's a highly automated process. What's important is that we can include all kinds of data sets, and then the results are displayed in this user interface, and it's interactive, so the users can then look at can sort the information, the data for different criteria. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, what we find is that so we work with a lot of data sources, including the eGuide one, and we can bring together all kinds of user data that we are working with, public sector data, and our own data sets to create an integrated energy demand planning. And what we do then is, as we have, when we've looked at villages that are particularly interesting from the point of view of energy demand for electrification, in these examples, we're working on mini grid work. Then we look into the village in more detail and connect those larger and smaller customers in a way that makes sense for the construction of a mini grid. So typically, the denser areas would be connected perhaps by a grid. The less dense areas would be supplied with a solar home system. What we do is we look at we do it kind of at village level in a detailed assessment of energy demand. We pair information such as the eGuide data, for example, with load curves that we have from users we work with, and we then look at the cost side, the distribution cost side, which is a result of the mapping you see here. And predict revenue and other viability factors. And we've done that now in the Kenya case, but also in various other countries at the country level and with companies at the level of individual villages. If you could please go to the next slide. Yep, so just as a quick outlook, Simone, maybe I'll just talk about the two that we're doing, and then you can speak a little more about the expansion of eGuide. So we will put the Kenya analysis that we've done together with eGuide. We'll upload that onto the user interface soon, so it will be available to anybody who wants to use it. And in the meantime, there's the report available on the website with the link given of how we estimated demand in Kenya. Simone,
Sure.
I'll pass back to you.
Oh, thanks, Tobias. So as part of eGuide's plans, we are planning on extending our electricity prediction service or consumption prediction service beyond Kenya, which is our current offering on our API. And immediately we're targeting to have predictions for Rwanda and Uganda, and also move beyond the residential sector. just as a note, we're also open to collaborating with other people and making partnerships with places that we might not currently have considered, so that we can also offer that later on.
Great, and I think that's it. We're through with our presentation.
Thank you, Simon and Tobias, for that. This is fantastic, and I'm seeing several questions come in, which I hope we'll get to at the end. Before I hand it off to Madeline, if I may, just ask a couple of questions. One of which is this is fantastic. I'm wondering, maybe this is a question for you, Simon. This is a predictive tool. Are you actually being able to predict the amount, a quantitative value of energy demand, or is it kind of categories high, medium, and low? Can you say a little bit more about kind of what's the output from this kind of service?
Yes. So currently we predict categories of consumption, or what we call levels of consumption, with predictive tools. Predicting an actual kilowatt hour value is somewhat of a harder task, especially because we are doing consumption prediction, not consumption estimation. So we are saying, given today's information, what we know today of an unconnected household, what do we anticipate their level of consumption to be upon making a connection? So for now, we're doing levels of consumption. Right.
And I would assume that part of what went into this is some element of validation to see how predictive this is. Can you say more about kind of the predictive power of the data?
Yes. So to tune our models, we have leveraged data from utilities. In this case, for Kenya, with Kenya Power, we've been in collaboration with them, and they've been able to provide us with data that has helped power some of our learnings to make these predictions. So yes, we validate our data with actual usage from the meters for residential customers to ensure that our models are indeed picking up information that is representative on the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe just one last thing, maybe less of a question, but I certainly made note of it because I think you clarified that the work to date has focused on residential, but you're looking to expand into SMEs. Can you say a little bit more about kind of what falls within that SME bucket? What sort of structures and buildings or economic activity might be included in this next phase?
So I'd say that initially we're concentrating on small and, like you mentioned, SMEs, so small shops, small businesses, maybe run out of households, and understanding not only how they consume electricity, but what we anticipate they'll use upon connection. Some of my colleagues have already done work in understanding that consumption, and now I just focus on the predictive step. So again, that is also powered by utility data. Again, we've had a good collaboration with the utility in Kenya, and we're leveraging our knowledge on small, medium-sized enterprises there, combining with satellite imagery and other data sources to infer what people would use upon electrification.
Fantastic. Thanks, Simon, for the clarification. Yeah, I mean, this is immensely useful for planning purposes, I can see, and very happy to see that TFE and Avida have already begun doing that, putting this data in practice, and look forward to seeing how this develops. But we'll obviously have more questions for you, again, kind of towards the end of the webinar. Let me now invite Madeline to join the discussion. And again, Madeline's going to shift from electricity consumption to what households can actually afford in the way of electricity in off-grid communities. So Madeline, the floor is yours. I think your slide is teed up.
Thanks so much, Jem. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and great to speak on such an important topic. and one that is really central to the entire purpose for being for Nithyo. So if you can please advance to the next slide. A little bit of background on who Nithyo is, what we do. So as Jem mentioned, I am the Chief Data Scientist at Nithyo. I lead our work in developing our proprietary creditworthiness modeling and analytics products. But really the core motivation for what Nithyo does is to facilitate the scaling of off-grid energy solutions through the scaling of financing. So if you can please advance to the next slide. I think this is a really interesting topic to bring into a discussion on integrated energy access planning, because I think to date there's been the perspective that there's been a focus on large-scale infrastructure or even mini-grid infrastructure as a solution to energy access. But from a broader perspective, there's a really innovative and well-suited packaging of solar home systems as a solution to energy access that by our estimation, over 270 million people have the ability to afford in Africa, which is the largest area of a lack of energy access currently. So, when we think about the market and what's really missing from, being able to scale that package solution, a solar home system kit that can be installed and sold by a retail model and financed through a pay-as-you-go, a very affordable financing structure, really what it boils down to is a lack of understanding of the affordability and the credit risk of those households. It stops the investors from being able to understand the portfolio quality of operators who are selling those systems, and it stops the operators from being able to understand their consumers and reaching, and targeting those households that really have that ability to pay. So Nithyo seeks to solve this by two mechanisms. One is the analytics, which is the work that I lead, and providing an alternative scoring and an alternative approach to estimating and understanding credit risk for those unbanked households, but also providing a scalable financing infrastructure which leverages that analytics and provides financial intermediation to help channel investment from donors or from commercial investors to those operators to facilitate greater access to electricity through off-grid solutions. So we'll have more big news coming on that financial intermediation facility in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that. But it's a core motivation to everything we do, and I'll touch more on this, to really facilitate the scaling of financing and the channeling of financing in an efficient and data-driven way. So next slide, please. And to go further into that point, so Nithyo's analytics solution, you could think about credit risk assessment and enhanced underwriting for solar home system sales as just facilitating kind of skimming off the top, right? Finding those customers that are most fully commercial, that have the highest ability to pay. But really what, taking a blended finance perspective and having the information about actual credit worthiness, it really actually enables a fully distributed solution to energy access to ensure that it really is universal. So through our modeling, we're able to understand those and identify and target those customers that have the highest ability to pay and the lowest credit risk, those that have a moderate ability to pay and really would benefit from the type of flexible pay-as-you-go terms that are suited or to their income streams or the type of product solutions that would suit them best. And also to identify those that have the most limited ability to pay and are truly concessional customers, and that grants or subsidies can be targeted. And this is, a really important element of planning to those households that really need it the most. And throughout all of this, enable every type of stakeholder and every type of funder to have a risk strategy and a consumer outreach strategy that matches their needs. Next slide, please. So how this works from a data perspective, I think one of the biggest differentiators that Nithyo is able to bring is using actual customer payment data. So looking at historical customer behaviors, joined with a really, really granular and detailed perspective of the representative household characteristics at a very high resolution. So we work with our data provider partner, Frame, who has developed these geospatial data layers that are derived from satellite imagery and survey data, very robust representative survey data, to provide very granular estimates of household characteristics such as their asset ownership, the types of economic activities in their area, their consumer spending patterns, discretionary spending, energy spending, at a really detailed level. And that's available across the entire continent of Africa. But what Nithyo is able to do is leverage that information along with actual observed consumer behaviors, which is really important when we're thinking about a unique financing solution, such as pay-as-you-go for solar home systems. Because of the kind of non-traditional financing patterns there, it's very challenging for traditional investors who might be more used to set terms to understand the expected repayment behavior. So we're able to use AI and machine learning to detect and segment those customers into kind of three main types of behaviors: those that are fast repayers who pay pretty much according to contract expectations, those that are moderate repayers that take a little bit longer to pay off but still are active customers, and those that are slow repayers and are at highest risk of actually churning and defaulting. So then we're able to build predictive models through our own algorithms to be able to assess that credit risk at a very early stage, or even before origination in a more generalized perspective, the relative credit risk of different households and types of consumers, and think about what that means from a valuation perspective. If there's a company who's trying to finance their portfolio of these types of customers, or they're trying to manage their cash flows, it's really important to know what's the relative value or relative expected revenue from those different types of repayment behaviors. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight one case study of how we've actually used this analysis, these analytics, to support energy planning specifically. So in collaboration with our partner Frame and with SE for All, we worked with the Nigerian Rural Electrification Agency to help them plan the Solar Power Niger project, the rollout of the solar home system allocation or allotments to reach their target of 5 million connections. So it's a target set by the government to help facilitate 5 million solar connections. And I think, first of all, would really commend, I think, the foresight of the REA and the Nigerian government to include solar home systems as an integral part of this initiative. And also for really having a very data-driven priority to use data to help make that more efficient. So we used the frame data, the household survey data and satellite imagery layers, as well as Nithyo's credit risk assessment to identify communities, those 1 square kilometer communities, and estimate the size of those communities, the actual consumer markets, to identify kind of this target, the target type of household for the solar connections. So the main driver of that, there were a couple different layers, which I'll show, but one of the main drivers was understanding which communities have an ability to pay for at least a tier 2 electrification system. So that was developed using the consumer spending data that we had available, and then layering on from Nithyo's sort of generalized understanding of credit risk and how the different socioeconomic characteristics of those areas would drive likely credit risk and repayment behavior to identify those priority areas. And then grouping those into actual allotments that would be provided through the data frame platform to solar home system companies that they could then go and using support from the REA program would be able to go and market their products to customers and receive concessional assistance in doing that. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the actual criteria that we used. So again, as I said, the first layer was the ability to pay. The second layer, filtering that down, is looking at which areas have existing electricity. And then finally, the last filter, which is what Nithyo produced, is that perspective of credit risk. So looking for communities where at least 50% of the households were determined to be high or moderate repayers per our credit scoring assessment. And this was really important because, especially to kick the program off, the REA wanted to identify areas that would support a retail kind of financing model for solar home system companies so that it's a sustainable program, that they're able to, find households that will be able to afford that type of system with that pay-go financing over the long run. So I think this is a really good example of how, a perspective on credit risk can enhance and not only, data for credit, data for energy planning, but specifically for the types of solutions that are finance driven, which could include not just solar home system companies, but also mini grid companies that are looking to understand where customers might be able to afford appliance systems that are financed on a pay-go basis, or agricultural products that are financed on a pay-go basis. But where you have that credit risk element, it's really essential to have a data-driven approach. And that's what Nithyo seeks to do.
Thanks, Madeline. That's fantastic. And I'm really happy you were able to showcase the really productive partnership in Nigeria. I think that really does demonstrate the power of combining this kind of data together in a very practical planning setting. Before we move on, I mean, it struck me, obviously, the data and the work that Nithyo and Frame are doing around credit risk and is immensely helpful in terms of targeting and obviously quite helpful to industry. But it seems to me also, with so much more attention now focused on, on subsidies, kind of a term that was perhaps not such a good term a few years ago. It's kind of coming back in vogue, and I think the sector is increasingly realizing that that certain segments of populations and sectors will require some form of smart subsidy. Can you say more? I mean, obviously, your ability to understand where there might be affordability gaps could inform kind of what level of subsidies may be required where. Is that a fair characterization of kind of what Nithyo and is capable of doing with its data?
Absolutely, and that's, I think, that second slide that I showed it's really a priority for us that our solutions are able to facilitate universal access, and that the financing that we're channeling, whether it's through an assistance of our data solutions to a partner that's providing that financing, or the financing that we're providing ourselves through our financial intermediary, is truly blended, and that we're helping target the right type of financing to the right risk level. So for example, you have a commercial bank that now understanding, where the bankable opportunities are, or where the bankable portfolios are, they can channel their financing there. Players like the World Bank or DFIs or grant providers can channel their financing to those that really need it most. And so you're kind of growing the whole pie. And that's really the mission of Nithyo, is to use data to scale that financing, because we know, we need 10x times the amount of investment going into the sector to reach universal access. And the ability to pay exists. We need to find it and target it, and find and target those that don't have the ability to pay with the right type of resources.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Hey, thanks, Madeline, and we look forward to the news that you were alluding to earlier. We'll look out for that. All right, let's now turn to Karen, who is going to talk about an aspect of demand, which is agriculture and agricultural productivity. I probably don't need to tell our audience, obviously there's a lot of attention on the importance of these kind of nexus issues, energy and agricultural value chains to, among other things, see how linking up energy with agriculture can help improve the business case for technologies and business models, for example, mini grids. So Karen, I'm going to hand it over to you for you to talk about kind of what Atlas AI has been doing in this space. And the floor is yours, Karen.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Karen Burns. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really fantastic to have this opportunity to talk about our work. So I'm the Director of Partnerships at Atlas AI, and I'm responsible for our interface with the development sector, which includes a portfolio of professional services work as well as pro bono engagements. And I also oversee our open data strategy here at Atlas. So what is Atlas AI? So we are a software company that's working to aid resource allocation in emerging markets. And we really exist as a firm to monitor the drivers of economic development across these emerging markets so that financial capital can advance societal well-being. And while we're a relatively new company, we were established in 2018, our approach is really built on decades of work by our founders, Dave Labelle, Marshall Burke, and Stefano Ehrman. We're all at Stanford University in the fields of agriculture ecology, economic development, and computer science, respectively. And so we're a company with some really interesting intersections going on. So first, there's the intersections of the work that David, Marshall, and Stefano really have pioneered. So they joined forces years ago to conduct research that showed that satellite imagery, survey data, and machine learning techniques could be combined to measure and understand a range of economic indicators in areas with very limited on-the-ground data. And they knew their findings were very powerful, and they also knew that they needed help expanding its reach. So herein lies the second really interesting intersection of our firm. So we are venture-backed, and our Series A funders are a mix of philanthropic and commercial groups. So like eGuide, we have a lot of our support from the Rockefeller Foundation, and we also have funding from Airbus Ventures as well as Micron Ventures. And this unique mix of philanthropic and commercial investment in combination with our designation as a public benefit corporation really allows us to firmly establish our balance between our continued interface with social sector as well as expanding our commercial outreach. So finally, the most important intersection for today's event is the intersectionality of our data. So at Atlas, we currently create and maintain rich data sets in these three buckets that you see on the screen. So we have household level asset wealth and consumption data. We have a range of agricultural productivity indicators, which I'm going to talk about today. And then we also have a big portfolio of work that's focused on infrastructure access and reliability. So within this vertical, we're currently focused on electrification and actively expanding that portfolio of work. And a lot of interesting connectivity between our group and eGuide as well. So as of now, all of our data is created for the African continent. So we have data for 49 countries. We really just can't do the small islands to date. And we have a pretty aggressive roadmap for geographical expansion in the coming years. So today I'm going to discuss our agriculture work in more detail, but I do want to emphasize that our approach as a firm is to create the data and tools that people need to understand how each of these spaces interrelate. So next slide, please. So understandably, one of the first questions we get, and that we should get, is can our information be trusted? Can our methods to derive these data sets be trusted? So largely in part due to our academic roots, much of our methodology has been rigorously tested and peer reviewed and published in tier 1 journals such as Nature Communications and Science. We don't take this burden lightly. We know that these statistics often determine the futures of millions of people by way of single decisions that are made. And we value our collaborations with academia and research-focused organizations, and we're going to be continued to be as transparent as possible with our approach. And on a quick side note, all of our publications can be found on our website, and we have the URL at the close of my presentation. Next slide, please. So today I'm here to talk about some of our work in agriculture. So we are very proud to partner with the LSMS team at the World Bank on some really exciting operational research in support of the 50 by 2030 Data Smart Agriculture Initiative. So 50 by 2030 is a global endeavor to help solve the agricultural data divide. Specifically, it focuses on improving country-level data by building stronger nationally representative survey programs. So our work within the initiative is focused on the intersection of satellite and survey data that allow for better insights into crop type mapping and yield estimations. And specifically, we're working to address two key barriers often faced by national government agricultural entities like Ministry of Agriculture or National Statistic Offices. The first barrier being how much and what kinds of these data do we actually need to produce insights? And barrier two is how do we help equalize access to that data as well as the methodology? So our goal in collaboration with the World Bank over the next couple of years is to generate satellite-derived public data sets and maps for a minimum of 5 countries. So we're about 1 year into our collaboration right now, and we're currently completing our analysis for Ethiopia and Malawi. And then the 3 additional countries that you see in italics on the slide are essentially on our to-do list. So this is what we're going to be tackling next. So our work is focused on production, cultivated area, and yields for 4 major cereals. And most really exciting to this is all of this data is going to be made available through a public user interface upon its conclusion. And in tandem, we're going to be publishing and promoting a protocol that can be used as part of 50 by 2030 supported surveys for collecting the minimum required survey data that can inform integrated survey satellite applications. Next slide, please. So we're very excited to be releasing our first publication in the coming months that starts to illustrate our findings based on our maize work in Malawi. So while our specific findings have not been released to date, we can share some of the kind of information that the forthcoming report will contain. So at the top of the screen, you see some very simple diagrams that illustrate the different types of collection strategies. Like for example, is it better just to get data from a corner of a field, a center of a point of a field, a grouping around centroid points, or looking at boundaries in slightly different ways? And so taking these very different approaches into consideration, our findings essentially illustrate how to do better with very limited data resources. And specifically, we're going to be providing recommendations for the optimal number of surveys, size of the data collection effort, and types of the data collection strategies. And this is just the first of many outputs that will contribute to our public data assets and protocols. And both us and the World Bank LSMS team will be actively promoting that work once it's released. So keep tabs on our website, keep tabs on LSMS website. They have some fantastic portals that they push out all of their information. So to be released in the coming months, if not weeks. Next slide, please. So last, I'd like to kind of zoom out to a continent-wide space, back to our work outside the 50 by 20 and 30 initiative. What we're especially proud of at Atlas is the ability for a methodology to provide insights across really large geographies. So on this slide is a high-level summary of our agriculture assets, all of which are currently available at the Admin 2 level. And we do have the ability to provide these types of insights at the 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer resolution with project work. So we use a host of different methodologies that are really based on data availability and viability. And what I think is especially important for this conversation is the fact that we can do this work for both rain-fed and irrigated cropland, which helps us to better understand the intricate relationships necessary for integrated energy planning. And that's essentially why we exist as a firm. And as we mature, we'll continue to produce data and software that allow decision makers to understand and plan for that interconnectedness. Next slide, please. So in close, I just want to leave you with some resources. So like I mentioned before, all of our publications, as well as a series of what we call Learn blogs, and this is a growing collection of information that we produce to help demystify our technologies, can be found on our website. Our platform Aperture, which just was released a couple weeks ago, contains all of our current and will contain our future open data assets. And this is really a resource that's maturing by the week. So I encourage everybody to sign up. As part of the sign up, all of our free data is available as part of our public plan. So everybody's welcome there, and that creates connectivity to our group and to our firm. And last, please just reach out directly to learn more about our work and our approach. Again, we're creating tools for decision makers. We're still in this fantastic phase of being very iterative with our process, with our procedures, and we want to hear, especially from decision makers on the ground, to how to make the data and our tools more valuable to you. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen. That's fantastic. And kudos to you and the team for making this data public. And yeah, I think we look forward to seeing how you are able to connect those verticals that you mentioned around agriculture and energy and electricity infrastructure. So look forward to seeing how that plays out. I think we have about roughly a little over a half an hour, and now we really wanted to pivot and kind of move to an open discussion with our different panelists. And again, I'm going to take the liberty of maybe getting the conversation started and posing a few questions to our four speakers, and then we'll turn in about 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how the discussion's going, to some questions that we're getting in from participants. So I guess with that, and I don't know if it's possible to kind of put all of our four speakers up, or maybe I'm just not seeing it, but if we are able to do that, that would be great, just so we can see all of our four speakers as we have this discussion. I guess one question to you, to all of you, and I think some of you touched on it, before we kind of delve into some of the really innovative technical work that you're doing, I'd like to hear from you all as to what you think have been the biggest benefits of better reflecting demand within kind of energy access decision making, whether it's kind of national level planning, whether it's village level planning, and how do you see these benefits kind of vary by the different users of this data? I'd be particularly interested to hear, Tobias, and maybe from you around, and others, from a government perspective, as well, Madeline, drawing on Nigeria and other experiences. What do you see as the biggest value benefit of better integrating this demand side data within planning? But then also others, feel free to jump in as to benefits for industry, DFIs, donors. So let's start there, kind of, the why. Why is this even how is this valuable to decision makers? If anyone wants to expand on that, that would be great. And just jump in. Yeah, go ahead, Tobias.
So that's a very broad question, and I have a couple of thoughts to just get this started. But one is that what we see is that as companies like ours and the others here and a couple of others out there in the world are gathering more data about remote areas, the understanding of remote areas is changing, and it gives policymakers, since you asked about policymakers, a different it gives these remote areas a different weightage. And in electrification, we see a shift towards more distributed electrification planning. And I think a large part of that is because we can make the needs of people in remote places more visible than ever before. I think that's one point. The second point is that, as you said initially, and that's particularly important for mini grids, but it's also important for kind of distribution companies and sales companies, we can improve the profitability of these companies. And that's absolutely important for their ability to raise more money. So of course, Madeline was talking about this before. In the mini-grid space, we see it when it comes to right-sizing systems, which really depends on energy demand. A third element that I would kind of put forward is that with these data analytical tools, we are getting to a point where we can scale operations and allow people to scale operations in a way that wasn't possible before. And that scale, of course, is key to, again, the profitability of the companies, transaction cost issues, but very fundamentally to achieving the goals that we want to, that we've set ourselves as a global community.
Thanks, Tobias. Madeline or anybody else want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think a very similar list, I suppose. I would summarize it by saying the biggest benefit is by enabling them to stretch their dollars further and achieve more impact and more access. So, like I was saying at the end of our conversation, Jem, really the efficiency of deploying the right type of solution and the right type of capital is you're only able to do that if you have more information about what the needs are and what the affordability, what the market kind of access is. And I think it's interesting to think about it for across those different groups that you talked about. So for governments, I think, and when we were discussing with the REA, a big part of it is about, making sure that their constituents are reached in an equitable way. So that those allotments that we designed, ensuring that, there's equitable reach, that the underlying characteristics, even though there are very different, dynamics between different regions in Nigeria, that the companies are being encouraged and being kind of mandated to serve them in an equitable way. But at the same time, then thinking about it from the industry's perspective, exactly as Tobias said, making sure having the data to know, how to structure their businesses, what the affordability gap is, so that they can, lobby or leverage, the government funders to make sure that they're not being asked to do things that are unsustainable or that would kind of crunch the market. And having them have stronger unit economics and more sensible financing structures that are tied to that underlying portfolio health. And then I think from a donor perspective, it's the value for money, right? The can we impact more people? Are we using funds responsibly? Can we show that with evidence and make the case for our taxpayers or our stakeholders? So I think that from our experience, that's sort of the trifecta of why having better information about affordability in particular is so essential.
Fantastic. I don't know if Simone or Karen have anything else to add here. If not, I'm happy to kind of throw out a few other questions. Karen, you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
Just one thing too, just building on Tobias and Madeline's point too, I think the breadth and depth of the data that all these different initiatives have created and are working with, like the temporal extent of these data assets is pretty tremendous. So like when we can go back in time too and start to understand what this interconnectedness actually means, and then to demonstrate proof of concept and to get both social sector and private sector continuing to invest in these communities and think about things a little bit more holistically than we've been able to do in the past, I think it has the ability to be pretty transformative to investment strategies.
Thanks, Karen. That's a good point. Let me pose another question, because I think many of you are alluding to this somewhat insatiable appetite for more data because it's so useful. I'm curious how we as a sector kind of can encourage further advancements and investments in this kind of data. And I guess I'm curious, what do you see as any specific bottlenecks to continuing to do the good work that you all are doing moving forward? You mentioned, Karen, the temporal aspect of it. We want to see more of this data in more places at more granular levels. I I think some of this data is public, some of it is not. Can you speak to, again, I'd love to hear your views on what do you see as the barriers for getting more of this high quality, granular, available data out there to inform decision making, particularly as it relates to this kind of demand side data?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a couple of the major bottlenecks. First, speaking from a firm's perspective, again, we want to make as much of our data open and available as possible, but we are still constrained. We still have to make money in order to exist. So figuring out that right balance is tricky, and it's hard, and it's something that we've really grasped this challenge, and we're going to be leaning on partners that have tried to work in this weird space before as we develop our open data strategy. I think the second one too is just making sure that, again, just to the abundance of data, making sure that the right people have the right data and making decisions with the right data. So being, again, just transparency and methodology and capacitating people with the tools that they need to understand what's good and bad data. And then the third bottleneck, and something that I'm particularly interested in, that I've done most of my work in the health space actually, but always with the public-private interface, and just the limited capacity of government entities to take in, absorb, and use this data. This is a problem with governments all around the world, in any single country, every level of government. Resources are constrained, and some of just the simple functionalities of government, even things like longer hiring cycles, getting the right people in that can really, young, smart people that can really harness and take advantage of this data. This data methodologies change so fast. So really capacitating government, either government directly or the networks that support government decision-making to be able to ingest and analyze this data is paramount.
No, that's a fantastic point, Karen. I mean, the capacity to generate and use this data, particularly at the national country level, is certainly a bottleneck that I think needs to be addressed through institutional capacity building. Tobias,
can I just add? Yeah, Karen, I think I agree with everything you said. From our perspective, we're also a company, we're a business, but we are a social business because we chose this world to work in and make our living in. I think being a business in this world is important because the tools that we're developing and the solutions that we're developing are kept alive and edgy, sharp, relevant, in a way that tools wouldn't be if it's another NGO, another donor just puts out a platform and people can use it. And we make sure that users get direct value from it and that it feeds into the business models of our customers. And that's really, really important. It's not easy, speaking for us now, I don't know whether others share the experience, but it's not easy to fit our new kind of innovations and data-based business models into the existing structures when it comes to governmental procurement and DFIs, because they're not used to it. They're not used. There's a time gap to making innovation work happen, right? There are questions around validation and does it work and programming and all these things, and then there's a question around just the units that we're selling, right? They don't really, they're new to the system we're working in. So these are some challenges.
I could just add a little bit to that. Oh, Simon, I know that you haven't spoken yet, so please go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was going to highlight two things. One is following up on what Karen and Tobias said, which is partnerships. For us to be able to make predictions using utility data, it's taken a lot of years to build those relationships, and having to do that across multiple countries, you can imagine the amount of resources and time that it takes to engage at that level. And like they also hinted, it's hardly a static process. So you have to keep revisiting those relationships, getting new data to update your perspective on how people are growing and changing. So I'd say for us, as from a data acquisition and learning perspective, that has been one of the challenges for us. Now, looking on the other side, which is more around sharing the data with people who actually make decisions. One challenge that we faced is understanding what is the relevant resolution that is needed for people to make decisions while preserving people's privacy. It's such, I don't want to say like point of contention, but they somewhat pull in different directions where, and I think someone mentioned it, that they would ideally like individual kWh for every building. But at the same time, we have multiple considerations around privacy, around how do we make integrated energy planning decisions at different resolutions. So that's some of the considerations that we also need to think about.
Madeline, Simone, thank you so much for that comment, because it reminds me of a theme that actually emerged in our data and planning workshop that we held last summer, which this very question came up: is what's the right resolution for different kinds of decision making? And then how do you balance that tension with privacy concerns, for example? And, you know, I think as Madeline will know, we had to deal with some of these issues in the work in Nigeria with Rhea, in terms of having data at resolutions that perhaps we couldn't necessarily, or kinds of data that we perhaps had to aggregate for privacy reasons. So all that to say, that's an area that SC Frol is certainly keen on leading and contributing kind of a dialogue around kind of what level of resolution is appropriate for what kind of decision making. And so we look forward to kind of working with you all on that. Madeline, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, no, I think it's been covered well. I think I kind of have a related point to the resolution question, which is, and it touches as well on what Tobias was talking about earlier, where I think not all data questions can be open data solutions. And that's where you can tailor the granularity to the partner that needs it, right? So it's an appropriate level of granularity, as Simone was saying, to the partner that you're working with. But I think from the start, you need to have sufficiently granular data going in. So I think one of the bottlenecks that we've seen, particularly as we work with a lot of consumer level data that's being generated by companies, you know, that we can build custom and tailored and restricted solutions for them to manage those privacy risks. But if they're not collecting, you know, location data at a sufficiently granular level, for example, or collecting, you know, kind of the payments data at a sufficiently granular level, it becomes very challenging to then be able to work upwards from that. So if you start with a sufficiently root level of data, of raw data, then you can tailor the solution to the partner that you're working with appropriately. But we have to encourage, you know, various stakeholders to request that, you know, to when they're an investor who, you know, is working with companies in the space, to, you know, encourage them to collect that kind of information, to not just rely on aggregated or self-reported statistics. And that's another core function that Nithyo plays, is being able to validate that and start from the root data up. But yeah, definitely great topics and themes.
Just on this question, I mean, you raised a good point, Madeline, around, this is another question I was going to ask around, you know, you mentioned stakeholders that are critical to generating or unearthing some of this data. I'm curious, can you say more? And again, this is a question to all of you, kind of what sorts of stakeholders do you think we need to better engage to generate this kind of data? Who's not at the table? You know, utilities sit on a lot of valuable data. Often we don't typically engage them, although, you know, I'm sure Simone and the e-guide and probably many of you do, probably the exception, not the rule. I'm curious your thoughts on who do we need to do a better job at in terms of engaging to unsurface some of this data?
Yeah, I think it's the entities that are interacting daily with these consumers that are by their nature of the services that they provide going to have access to that information. So I think that's one, and I think it is challenging certainly for some of the kind of semi-public entities or those that have more, they're just more bureaucratic, right? There's more layers to that process. And I think utilities is a big one. I'm sure Simone, could have some interesting thoughts on that. But from our perspective, you know, we've worked a lot with companies, solar home system companies, distributors, that have varying levels of capacity of their own data management. But I think for us, it's the way to engage them is by making the incentives aligned and showing them the business benefits for contributing to and using that data and the insights that we're providing to them. So I think it's, you know, it's not likely a good strategy, especially working with more private enterprises, to sort of mandate that. You have to make the business case for it, and that's, you know, I think why having third-party data analytics platforms, like many are represented here, you know, we're in a position to do that because we can provide tailored services.
And I'd like to add to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, thanks. Another really, I think, key player, especially in the agriculture space. So there's a lot of work that's out there that's trying to collect data directly from farmers themselves, which is one really exciting new kind of future frontier. And then I also think there's a lot of value in collaborations with cooperatives and other groups that have existed for a very long time to do kind of collective thinking around the well-being of farmers, whatever kind of crop that they're producing. And I think that basically partnership with entities that basically have protection in mind and have the best interests of that ultimate end user to help build in those ingrained privacy protections, like were mentioned before, is a really critical piece to this puzzle.
Thanks, Karen. Anybody? Simone, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up a bit on Madeline's point. I think one observation that stands out to me is, although, say, utilities have large amounts of data, part of the challenge is determining what data is relevant also for what question. So there's really a need, I think, a need to have a space of collaboration where planners can highlight what questions they're trying to ask and get at, that would also tune utilities or energy providers or generators of this data as to what data is relevant for what question, either through like a consortia or something that allows people to speak with each other about what we're trying to solve versus what we need to solve.
That's a really good point, Simone. And that was, again, something that was raised in our workshop over the summer, is that there needs to be a space for this kind of open dialogue between all these various stakeholders. I think all of you have your own probably bilateral relationships and discussions, but perhaps more of an open platform is necessary. I have an eye on the clock, and we have been tracking some questions from participants. So I'm going to maybe pivot and pose a few questions to you all, if you don't mind. And again, kudos to our participants who have been having somewhat of a nice, lively dialogue on the side, which is great. Encourage you to do that. One of the questions that's come in, and the team has been kind of aggregating, I think, similar questions, and I think it's probably a question that is applicable to any one of you. It really has to do with how you, and this is kind of now getting more into the technical realm, how do you balance model predictions with ground truthing data? I think it kind of gets back to an earlier question or comment I had around the predictive power and the accuracy of what you're doing. I think obviously one theme in this webinar is that all of you in one way or another are making use of some really sophisticated machine learning and remote sensing and analytics to very cost effectively generate data that can be very useful. But on the other hand, you know, there's a trade-off in doing that in the way of accuracy and predictive power. Can any one of you speak to kind of how you instill confidence and accuracy in your data? Talk about any kind of ground truthing that you do along the way.
Yeah, Jem, if I may, just that's a really important question, because it's because people ask that. Karen showed it in her presentation. It's one of the first things people ask. Now, I think there are two things. One is, what's the required level of accuracy? What's a good level of accuracy that we actually need, right? We don't need 100% accuracy. We need something that's significantly better than almost nothing we work with at the moment, right? The second thing is then how do we validate and how do we move to ever greater accuracy? And I don't think there is a trade-off between using the technologies and the accuracy, because we, for example, constantly do what we call validation partnerships. We work with companies without being paid for it and design validation systems, right? For example, we work with Engie in Tanzania and said, they give us data of a number of existing sites. Sorry, they tell us the geolocation of a number of existing sites. Then we use our tools to predict which of these sites we think is a better site for mini-grid development, which site is a worse site. Then afterwards, we look at their existing, their actual, consumption and business data and compare that to our prediction. It's just one way of doing it. And these things are also available on the websites. There are different types of validation models we run. But the good thing, I think that the more we work, and that's probably true for all of us, is the more we do with every project we do, we improve the underlying technology, we improve the predictive power. The more data sources, and there's a big question about quality of data sources, but you need to filter out the ones that are not good. But the more data sources you use, the more you can triangulate, and the more you can, and the more independent data sources, like we work, for example, a lot with satellite data and on-ground data, which are two completely independent data sources. They reinforce each other in a really good way. So it's actually something that's going to get better and better, I think.
Thanks, Tobias. Simon, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just to follow up on Tobias's point about validating it with, at least in our case, with our utility data, we also try to validate it with externally collected independent data sources. For example, there's the MTF survey that has measured electricity consumption in Kenya, for example, and we use that for our validation. There's also the third point I was going to make is there's also a need to do spatial validation, in the sense that you might do well in some places, but not as well in other places. And
That's
for
true.
us, part of our spatial validation is also that we share our confidence levels of our predictions. So we say that our model is more confident here or less confident here, so that it can also help planners understand how to process the outputs from our models in addition to the predictions themselves.
Thanks, Simon. Madeline, Karen, did you have anything else to add on this? If not, it's okay. I may pose one additional question, if you all don't mind. I think we're nearing the hour, so we're going to need to wrap this up relatively soon. I'm just kind of looking at some of the questions, and I think, let me give credit to all of our speakers, because we had a long list of questions at the beginning and you all have basically answered most of them. So the reason I'm struggling to come up with questions is that you've done such a good job at actually answering many of the questions that were posed. There is one in particular, I think it's an interesting one, around this issue of how you disaggregate data. As governments pursue equitable access to energy, I'm wondering, are there levels of disaggregation that you all would like to be able to achieve with regards to the different dimensions of demand that you're focused on? And what I mean by that is, you could certainly apply a gender lens to all of this and say, I'd love to have this data by female-led households, or you can imagine different levels of disaggregation that would be quite helpful in targeting those who are the most vulnerable, for example, or the least well-off or disadvantaged. Are you seeing any, movement in that direction of further disaggregation by some of these kind of more equity-based issues, whether it's gender or other kind of variables?
Yeah, I was getting to the question that was asked in the chat, because I think it's actually a really interesting one about particularly when you have concessional assistance that you're trying to deploy and target efficiently. Those different lenses of vulnerability are very important, and there are different priorities for different donors or or for governments. And I think that's one of the reasons we're really excited about the particular type of geospatial data that we're able to leverage at NIFIO. So our partner Frame, because they source not just from satellite imagery, but also from these expansive household surveys, have a lot of indicators that maybe we wouldn't think about for just pure demand calculations or ability to pay, but have a lot of other important lenses. So for example, with the COVID crisis, where are households that are particularly at risk of health comorbidities or economic impacts from shutdowns? That's something that we integrated into our models very quickly to help compensate for changes in the market, but also things like gender. And I know Frame is investing quite a lot in disaggregating their layers by gender. They have from their source data, what households are headed by women, or there are other health factors or household size, or I think the point about disabilities is a really interesting one that I haven't looked into, but I think now I'm quite keen to. But I think because, if you're able to draw on those more contextual sources of information about the demographics, that's when you can start weaving it in and kind of disaggregating and layering. And it's something that's quite important to us.
And I'll build on that too, that a lot of the underlying data right now from these different groups is pulled from similar surveys, DHS, LSMS, some of these big global, and there's really interesting interconnectivity between all these different firms and those at USAID and at World Bank. And so there's interesting feedback loops also being created that are not only can groups like ours extract from those surveys, but what kind of additional information do we need to think about to put into those surveys that can kind of go back into the loop.
Thanks, Karen. Any final words from Tobias and Simon before we wrap up?
Just thank you, I suppose. It's great that you're taking it upon yourself to push this data story, because I think one of the things we all really need is showcase the work we're doing and show how it can be effective and how it can be used, and use it more widely. Thanks.
Thanks, Tobias.
I'd say it's quite exciting to see that data and consumption demand is gaining much traction, and just want to encourage everyone to engage more on the topic. Like I said, I'm sure the panelists are willing to engage, but yeah, it's quite exciting to see that. Thanks.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's been a really great discussion, and I think back, to the kind of meta point above the using data, which is this whole need for integrated energy planning, right? And using a multitude of different solutions to achieve energy access. And I think, that's a really important lens. And really, I think that the only way to achieve that is by having better information about what solutions are needed for different types of consumers and households. And yeah, I think it's exciting to see the ways, there's a lot of overlap, and I think the sources of data that we variously use, but there's a lot of complementary ways that they can be pulled together. So grateful for the opportunity to talk today.
Thanks, Madeline.
And echoing ditto, ditto, ditto on all of that as well. And I do think it's really interesting too, just like the abundance of data, the abundance of firms, and just kind of echoing Tobias too, the importance of forums like this where we can learn from each other and shift our thinking a little bit too, and think about how we can work more as a collective and trying to obtain these shared goals. So thank you very much.
Karen, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers today. That really was our intent, as I mentioned at the beginning, was to showcase kind of progress that's being made and innovations that are being led by the likes of all four of you in this space. If I didn't explicitly mention it before, this is the kind of the first in a series of webinars that are part of our integrated energy planning program. So there's a lot more to come in terms of our own work in this space, but we did want to create at least some sort of virtual space to continue this discussion around, data in particular, and we wanted to start it with a bit of a focus on the demand side, as that's kind of where we saw the biggest gap. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you to all of our participants for joining. I will mention that all of your questions will be answered if they have not been answered in kind of one. We're going to compile all the questions and answers in a document that hopefully we will share with all of you on the website. Again, you know, a reminder to check our website for not only the recording of this, but the presentations, as well as the answers to many of the questions that came up. Yeah, and again, encourage you all to visit SE for All's website to learn more about upcoming webinars, upcoming work in this integrated energy access planning space. And I think with that, I'm going to say thank you and have a good rest of the day, and look forward to staying in touch, everyone. Be well.